In this video, I'll cover 3D walkthroughs. Several of the settings from the stationary walkthrough video are applicable to this video, and you may find that a helpful resource. For this session, I'll provide a brief overview of how to create a 3D walkthrough and then spend most of the time looking at existing walkthrough paths from our sample plans and how you can accomplish similar results. If you're looking for more of the how-tos in creating a 3D walkthrough, we have a separate video that covers the process in more detail. Let me first start with the process of creating a 3D walkthrough path. There are a few ways you can do this, and the first way is from the option in the 3D menu. From this menu, you can choose to create a 3D walkthrough path. I'll just create a simple walkthrough path that starts at the entry door here. I'm going to click and drag with my left mouse button, release, click and drag with my left mouse button, and release, and that's going to end the path. And to get out of the creation mode, I'll press the space bar. You see my cursor change to an arrow. Now this has created a keyframe, 1, 2, and 3, each time that I've clicked and dragged the mouse. These keyframes, you can click on them and orient the view toward the point of interest you're interested in. So there's a diamond here. You can click and drag those towards the point of interest. And the easiest way to position your cameras is to use the Preview Walkthrough tool. You'll find that in the lower Edit toolbar. It's called Walkthrough Preview. The Walkthrough Preview is a little bit more taxing on your system. However, it will allow you to dial in the exact views for each of these cameras. On keyframe number 1, I come up and you can see how I can actually move the camera. I can dolly it around. This works on the keyframe. If you use the scrubber tool, this little green arrow down in here, and I move that, I actually can't move in between the different keyframes. So I need to be on a keyframe. Let's double click on keyframe number 2 here, and notice how I get the framing of the scene in with the outside definition, and then my camera changes to the dolly. I can adjust that camera, and again double click on keyframe number 3. I get the outline surrounding the scene. My camera changes to a dolly, and I can make the adjustment. Each one of the keyframes has information about the height and the floor and the time, the angle, and this information can be adjusted on a per keyframe basis. We've been adjusting the camera and tilt angle. If I want to adjust the height, come in here and I'll make this adjustment. Let's set it to 84 inches. Based on that height adjustment, I may want to take the camera and tilt it down so the point of interest in the island is visible in the scene. Now, if I move back to keyframe number 2 by double clicking, this camera is set at a height of 60 inches and keyframe number 3 was set to 84 inches. As the scene moves along, and let's just use the scrubber bar here and let's move along the current frame. So what's going to happen is the camera is going to raise in height between frame 2 and 3 over the course of about 24 inches. It will move the camera in a linear fashion in between those two keyframes. In between each of the keyframes, notice that between keyframe number 2 and number 3, there is a speed after the camera. For each of your cameras, with the exception of the very last frame, you can control the speed after your camera. So if you want to slow something down, speed something up, you can do that in between these keyframes. If I have a curve, you notice that this curve comes around in my plan view. I may want to slow that down between keyframe 1 and 2. As I go back to keyframe number 1, and I'll come into the speed, I may want to slow that down to be quite slow, and the speed between keyframe number 1 and number 2 would be at 1 foot per second, so quite slow. A lot of times I will record the walkthroughs slower, and then I may speed them up in post-processing and with an external video editor. Keyframes can be group selected. If I want to hold my shift key down and select both frame 1 and 2, I could come in, make the adjustment on the height. I'll set those both to 84 inches. Anytime you want to make a similar change between your keyframes, group selecting them can be an easier process to do that. Let's select keyframe number 1. The sun angle was defaulted to 10 a.m. on July 4th. If I want to make an adjustment on the sunlight, I have the option of using a generic sun or any of the sun angles that I've already created in the plan. I can use those sun angles. You can also use different sun angles per keyframe. And as I move to keyframe number 2, the sunlight is being derived from keyframe number 1. So it's going to inherit the sunlight information for both keyframe 2 and 3. If you want to change those in between, I'll show you a scene that I've done that to create a sunset effect. That can be a useful process. Now in keyframe number 3, one of the features that I like to do is pause on this final frame. To do that, there's an option down here for this keyframe number 3 to use the pause keyframe. I can enter in the pause duration. So if I change that to maybe 2 seconds, the recording will then pause that last frame for a couple of seconds. That allow the viewer to focus on the final frame. Notice the indentation of that keyframe in here, start and end. And again, this is just a nice feature to be able to focus on your final frame so the video just doesn't abruptly end. Now let's take a look at the define option toward the top of the preview panel. On the general panel, this information is inherited from the keyframes and the walkthrough path as well as your walkthrough defaults. I'll open up those defaults in a minute. The information on each of the cameras repeated that you already have in the preview, as well as the sun information, the keyframe size, which is in your floor plan view, how big you want these keyframes, some of the height information. Sometimes you want to set your camera heights absolute or relative depending on how your terrain is. There is the ability to do sun interpolation. If you want to change the sun angle information, right now I have all the same sun. When I open up one of the samples, I've changed that. The sun interpolation can be changed from a time-lapse mode interpolation to a seasonal, and then there's an option to overlay the sun information, timestamp, the resolution of your video, and then it gives you some stats on the duration and how many frames per second. On the cameras, similar information that you may have in your typical camera settings, you can choose the rendering techniques. I will show you where I've recorded in all of the different rendering techniques. And as you go into the define option for your camera, you have the same type of settings for rendering. If you want to record a standard walkthrough and put hand-drawn lines on top, then you can define exactly what the fidelity is for those lines. We cancel out of this. There are settings if you want to include shadows, reflections, those are for mirrors. If you want to animate water, good for an outdoor scene, maybe if you have a swimming pool. And then your lighting information, typically I always recommend you use a light set. I've got a number of light sets. Since I'm doing a kitchen, I would change the light set. Again, you typically want to set this up exactly the same way as you do with a render camera, and I'll show you how to generate a render camera. There's an option over here I use to generate a render camera. Then I dial that in and then apply those settings inside of the camera scene. Backdrop, if you're going to be creating a walkthrough, I would either use a generated sky. That will be a panoramic view and rotate with the camera. If you're going to be using your own backdrop, make sure that you use a spherical backdrop. I've seen walkthroughs where the backdrop does not rotate properly and it looks a little confusing and maybe isn't the best view. And if you don't have one and you don't like the generated sky, simply just don't use a backdrop. It can be white or blue outside of the windows. A few other settings for the walkthrough panels. I'll skip over those for now. As I mentioned, when you're creating your walkthrough, you want to dial in all of your render settings. You can click on these keyframes, and right now I'm on keyframe number 3. You see the preview up here, and if I use the tool, I'll mouse over this here so you can see it, create a camera view from the current preview frame. Let me go ahead and click on that. The camera view is created. It matches the scene. You see the preview panel, you see the 3D scene, and now I can go in and modify this scene and then transfer any information that I find valuable in here. Underneath the tool called Edit Active View, let's just make a couple of adjustments in here. Let's change the camera to the physically based. Then I'm going to use the Adjust Sunlight, and then I'm going to choose a specific sun angle. We'll use the July 4th at 10 a.m. And then finally, I'm going to adjust the lights. And in the Adjust Lights dialog, I like to use light sets. It specifically forces the program to turn on specific lights. I do it by room. When I click the drop down, you can see that I have a kitchen living light set. I'll sort that based on what's on. So you can kind of see as I scroll down that most of the lights that are turned on are in the room of interest, the kitchen, the living room, the wine room. And then once I've made those settings, let me close this preview. Select defaults. Let's let the program rebuild and generate the view. This will take just a second. We'll give it a second to denoise the view. And now I see what the scene would look like. This is in a physically based mode. I can also toggle on hand-drawn lines. Let me use the shortcut tool over here on the left-hand side. So when I set up my 3D walkthroughs, I will usually generate a 3D camera. And then I can take this camera and rotate around. I can look at it. I can look at the sun information and make sure that all of the settings that I want look good in a typical 3D view. And then I can open up my 3D walkthrough, usually on keyframe number 1, and make those same settings. So that's the typical process that I would go through in creating a 3D walkthrough path. Let me switch gears. Let me close these views up here. Now before we reverse engineer and pick apart a few different walkthroughs that have been created in the sample plans, I'm going to show you a different way to create a walkthrough path. This one was created right out of the 3D menu. I'm going to click on this and delete it. I find sometimes in creating a walkthrough path, I like to just do it with a CAD line tool. Using the line tool, I'm going to come in, I'm going to click and drag to create segment number 1, segment number 2, and segment number 3. I'm going to take this middle segment and I'm going to create an arc out of it. And then there's a Make Tangent tool. Let's go ahead and make it tangent. And now I have a perfect arc. I can convert that into a walkthrough path and put the keyframes on it. When I click on the line, there's a tool in my bottom edit menu, Convert Polyline. And as I scroll down toward the bottom of it, there is the option to convert it into a walkthrough path. And then I can go in and make some adjustments into the default settings for the walkthrough path. I'll go ahead and accept the default settings here. And now I have a walkthrough path created. Again, the same type of editing. If you need to add another keyframe in here, while the path is selected, there's a tool in the lower edit menu, Add Keyframe, and then go into the Preview panel and make the same adjustments. And I find this a little bit easier sometimes than creating a walkthrough spline where I can kind of explicitly draw the lines myself. Let's look at one final way. As I zoom out, you see that I have a circle all the way around the structure. Just pull that down just a little bit so we see it. So this is a 360 view that will go all the way around the house. And one of the things that I will typically do is if I take a 3D view, and we'll just kind of come in here, point and click, and you see that I'm outside the perimeter of the house a bit. As I move back over into the floor plan view, one of the tools that I like to do, let's click on the camera itself. One of those tools is to create and I'll mouse over this so you can see what it says, create an orbital path, and that's going to create a 360 path that will surround the structure. And what I might do before I do that is I like to maybe point that right into the centroid of the structure, and then when I use this tool that is create an orbital path, you can see that get generated. It's very close to the other one that I had since it's outside the perimeter of the house itself. And now the camera will follow all the way around that path. Right next to that camera was a tool we may have used in a previous segment here, and that's called Create a Stationary Walkthrough. And that will allow you to see the scene for a seasonal or a time lapse. You can also animate the water. So those are the main ways of creating your walkthrough paths. Now let me switch gears a little bit. Let's take a look at some of the existing walkthrough paths, and we'll discuss some of the tips that we can use in creating these walkthrough paths. I want to share a few tips with you before we open up and look at these videos. Make sure you place a north pointer in your plan. Also set your sun angle. It's going to give you a little bit more realistic view. I'm using a sample plan here called the Hawk's Nest. If you go down to floor 0 and I scroll down here, you can see that I've created a north pointer and my sun angles. I've created a handful of those. These are important. I put these on floor 0. That's where my landscape is. I've got a swimming pool down there, so it's walkout, so it made the most sense to put those on floor 0. Consider defining a layer set that you can use for walkthroughs. I try to have all my accessories turned on, some of the vehicles, so I know where the points of interest are that I want to go around. I can also isolate so there isn't a bunch of noise in here. So I use a layer set. Notice that I'm using a saved plan view called walkthrough, and if I open up my layer display settings, it's using a layer set called walkthrough. So it kind of is a clean looking view for those things. We already looked at using the preview to adjust your walkthroughs. It's a little bit more time consuming to use that preview, but it really makes a difference. When you're going to record your walkthrough, 30 frames per second. 60 is going to give you higher fidelity. I mentioned using a panoramic backdrop or maybe the generated sky, so your backdrops move seamlessly as you turn corners. When you have an angle in your walkthrough path, let's just kind of zoom in here and take a look here. You can see that I've got one that's got quite an angle in here. Anytime you're turning a corner, let's zoom in a little bit closer. I've got quite a few keyframes in here. When you're going to be turning those corners, slow your camera speeds down. And my recommendation on that is maybe slow it down to 0.25 feet per second. And to put that in context, a lot of people may walk, if you're kind of walking down a hallway in a brisk form, that's maybe 4 feet per second. I've got that orbital walkthrough. I'm probably going to go at 12 feet per second. And I want it to go pretty quick, but it's also at a very far perimeter from the structure itself. When you create a walkthrough path, and let's say you have a whole house, one of the things that I do is I use small walkthrough paths and stitch it together with an external video software. I try to avoid having one large walkthrough path. They're time consuming to record, and also if you find making edits to it, it can just be time consuming. So I usually create small walkthrough paths. You see I have a bathroom, a closet. I will create a walkthrough video outside of Chief Architect by stitching those together. So underneath the default settings, let's look at some of the walkthrough properties in here. Again, this will, anytime you create a walkthrough path, it will use this information. So your keyframe size, your sun angles, sun interpolation, the resolution size, frames per second, your video codec. I typically use the default there. What's your default camera? Mine's the standard. You want animated water turned on, your backdrop information, and then a few other things. So if you want to make those changes in your default every time you create a walkthrough path, it will then use those properties. Zoom in and let's look at a few of these walkthrough paths that I have. I've got one that comes in the kitchen, and you can see how it comes in the entry door, looks at the island, comes around, and then I've got a number of cameras right in here that peek at the sink and then come back out and look outside the window. Let's play that, and then we'll open up the keyframes and talk about it a little bit. So that walkthrough took into effect 8 different frames. You can see that in the floor plan view as well as in the preview panel. And on the final frame, you notice that how the sun sat. Looked in another session about creating sun studies. You can do the exact same thing in your walkthroughs. So as we kind of look at keyframe number 1, this is using the sun angle at 6 p.m. And then that same sun angle is going to be used all the way through keyframe number 7. And then on keyframe number 8, you're going to see that it's going to be doing an interpolation. And as I look at the final frame, because this is being paused, and then the sun information is at 9:30 p.m. So that means it's going to interpolate the sun in a time-lapse mode from 6 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. and you get the effect of that sun moving, and that's kind of a interesting effect. And then as we went around the sink, come into keyframe number 5, 6, and there's a pause in here. See, this is a pause, and it paused it for just 1 second. Those are all the different effects and using it as we've talked about in the session so far. Now as I kind of scroll out and we look at another one, I've got a kitchen approach, and I'll highlight this. And there's really kind of 3 segments in here. The kitchen approach, the rear of the island, and then the front of the island. And I've recorded these in each one of the different camera styles. This is a different way than the spline that I've created circling around it. This allows you to kind of focus on the things. And I'm going to play the different recordings, and we'll kind of buzz through these a little bit, but it'll give you an idea how the different rendering techniques. Remember, you just go into the define option, and then on the cameras you change them to be each one of the cameras. So take a look at these, and let's come back on after we've played through those. It really depends on the style you like. Maybe you had a favorite there. As I open up the camera, I wanted to just point you to a couple of things when I recorded those. When you're going to be recording with a physically based ray trace, or for that matter the clay, they take longer. And that's because it's calculating a lot more light data. For the physically based, also when you go in and you hit the define option, if you use hand-drawn lines on top, it adds a little bit more edges and it takes longer to do. When I switch over to the clay view, one of the things that I did was you can use the layer color. So the camera has layers, and then you can set up the layers based on the camera. And if you're curious about how that works, you could download the Hawk's Nest sample plan. There's a layer set called Z Camera, and all it is a couple of layers that are just a little bit different, and then you can use the layer color for the clay camera, and then again the drawn lines on top, especially in the clay view, I think add a nice little edge. Well, that's all I've got for the session. Thanks for watching, and hope you create some great 3D walkthroughs.